Imagine waking tomorrow to find your refrigerator gone, your stove vanished, and your pantry emptied of everything except some barley, dried peas, and perhaps a bit of salt. The corner coffee shop? It doesn't exist. The grocery store around the block? Gone. Your breakfast choices have suddenly become both drastically limited and extraordinarily complex. Welcome to breakfast, circa 1025 CE. In the shadow of crumbling Roman influences and amid the rise of feudal kingdoms, men and women awakened each day, facing the most fundamental of human needs. They had no concept of balanced nutrition, no understanding of vitamins, and certainly no packaged cereals promising whole grains and added calcium. Yet what they ate to break their fast reveals more about human ingenuity, social hierarchy, and cultural identity than perhaps any other daily practice. The word breakfast itself tells a story, literally the breaking of a fast undertaken since the previous evening's meal. But when that fast was broken, how it was broken, and what foods constituted this first meal varied dramatically across continents, climates, and classes. While a 21st century breakfast might be skipped entirely or consumed hurriedly between commuting tasks, breakfast a millennium ago was deeply tied to seasonal rhythms, religious practices, and the brutal realities of manual labor that awaited most people. In medieval Europe, a nobleman might begin his day with wine-soaked bread and perhaps a piece of salted meat, consuming it leisurely within castle walls. Meanwhile, just beyond those walls, a peasant family would already be hours into their workday, having broken their fast with a simple porridge of barley or rye, possibly flavored with a precious pinch of salt or wild herbs gathered from nearby. Woods, half a world away, in Song Dynasty China, urban dwellers lined up at street vendors for hot bowls of rice congee topped with pickled vegetables, while rural farmers began their days with steamed millet buns. In the sophisticated cities of the Islamic Golden Age, physicians were already developing theories about ideal breakfast foods, recommending dates, bread, and olive oil to begin the day healthfully. What people ate for breakfast a millennium ago was dictated not by preference or nutrition labels, but by geography, season, social standing, and religious decree. It was an era before global trade networks shipped citrus fruits to Northern Europe in winter or coffee beans from Ethiopia to tables worldwide. It was a time when breaking your fast meant consuming what was available, what was permitted, and what would sustain you through hours of physical labor. The absence of certain breakfast staples we now take for granted, coffee, tea, orange juice, or wheat toast with butter, would be immediately apparent to any time traveler visiting this period. Coffee wouldn't reach Europe for another 600 years. Tea, though consumed in China, was unknown to Europeans. Citrus fruits were rare treasures in northern climates, and dairy products were seasonal, perishable luxuries unless transformed into cheese or butter. Perhaps most striking to our modern sensibilities would be the blurring of lines between breakfast and other meals. Many people across medieval cultures ate essentially the same foods at each meal, with quantity rather than composition being the primary distinction. The modern concept of breakfast foods, dedicated recipes and ingredients specifically for morning consumption, was largely non-existent. As we examine what filled bowls and bellies at daybreak across different regions of the world in the early 11th century, we discover more than just historical curiosities. We uncover the foundations of culinary traditions that persist today, albeit often in drastically transformed forms. We see the origins of cultural attitudes toward the first meal that continue to shape our own relationship with breakfast. And perhaps most valuably, we gain perspective on how fundamentally our understanding of food, time, and daily rhythm has changed over 1,000 years of human civilization. Our journey through breakfast practices of 1025 CE takes us from the smoky interiors of English peasant cottages to Japanese imperial courts, from Islamic Spain to the Byzantine Empire, from Viking longhouses to the sophisticated urban centers of Tang Dynasty China. In each location, we'll discover how people confronted the universal human need to break their fast after sleep, using whatever resources their environment, technology, and social position afforded them. In the cold dawn of an English village, a woman stirs a pot suspended over a small fire in the center of her single-room dwelling. The smoke escapes through a hole in the thatched roof, or tries to at least. The air is thick and acrid. This is not the controlled flame of a modern stove, but the household's only source of heat, light, and cooking capability. Into this pot goes barley that has been dried and stored since the previous harvest. Water from a nearby stream brings the mixture to a slow boil. The woman adds a handful of dried peas and perhaps, if the household is fortunate enough, a small piece of salted pork for flavor. This is pottage, a thick, porridge-like staple that formed the backbone of the medieval English diet. Her children and husband will consume this meal from wooden bowls, using crude spoons or pieces of bread as utensils. There are no plates, no breakfast table, no chairs as we would recognize them. They eat sitting on benches or stools, perhaps even standing. The pottage is accompanied by ale, yes, even in the morning, as water sources were often contaminated, and ale provided both hydration and valuable calories. This scene, repeated with variations across thousands of humble homes throughout medieval Europe, represents perhaps the most common breakfast experience of the era. Pottage was ubiquitous, economical and practical. It required minimal attention once set to cook, freeing the household to begin their daily chores. It used ingredients that could be stored through winter. It was filling and provided sustained energy. The specific grains varied by region. Barley and rye dominated in northern Europe, while oats became increasingly important in Scotland. In areas with greater wheat cultivation, bread might replace pottage as the morning staple, though not the light, sliced wheat bread of modern breakfast tables. Medieval bread was dense, often dark, and frequently days old. Fresh bread was a luxury, and even when available, it might be reserved for those of higher status within the household. This is a crucial point in understanding breakfast in 1025. Food was not just nutrition, but a marker of social position. While peasants consumed their pottage, the lord of the manor and his family experienced a different morning entirely. In the great hall of a Norman castle, breakfast reflected abundance and privilege. Servants presented freshly baked manchet bread, white. Bread made from finely milled wheat flour, a symbol of wealth since the extra processing required more labor and yielded less flour. This might be accompanied by wine rather than ale, perhaps warmed with honey and spices if fashionable Byzantine influences had reached that particular noble household. Protein appeared more prominently on the noble breakfast table. Cold meats from the previous day's hunting, fish if near the coast or if the castle maintained its own fish ponds, perhaps eggs from the castle's chickens. Cheese might be served along with seasonal fruits when available. In the most sophisticated households influenced by returning crusaders or foreign trade, exotic additions like almonds or dried fruits might appear. Even the timing of breakfast showed social distinction. Laborers and farmers often ate shortly, after dawn, to fuel their morning work. Nobles might break their fast later, particularly during winter months, when hunting and other leisure pursuits began later in the day. Religious observations further complicated the breakfast landscape. The Christian Church mandated numerous fast days throughout the year, perhaps most famously during Lent, but also on Wednesdays, Fridays, and various saints' days. During these times, animal products were forbidden, forcing even the wealthy to adjust their morning meals. Almond milk became a crucial substitute for dairy, while fish replaced meat on permitted days. In monasteries across Europe, breakfast itself was considered somewhat problematic. Early Christian monastic rules often prescribed just 1 or 2 meals daily, viewing additional eating as potential gluttony. The Benedictine rule, followed by many monasteries, originally allowed for 1 meal daily during summer and 2 in winter, with the first meal effectively being lunch. However, by the 11th century, many monasteries had introduced a small morning meal called the mixtum, typically bread soaked in wine, especially for monks performing manual labor. This religious influence extended beyond monastery walls. For the pious throughout medieval Europe, breakfast choices reflected spiritual commitments as well as economic realities. The church calendar's alternating feasts and fasts created a rhythmic pattern of abundance and restriction that shaped breakfast traditions and contributed to the development of specific dishes and techniques. Crossing the English Channel to France, breakfast customs showed subtle but important variations from their English counterparts. In the northern regions, cereal grains dominated breakfast much as they did in England, though with regional preferences. Buckwheat became important. In Brittany, where it was used to make galettes, thin, crepe-like breads that could be filled with cheese or eggs on non-fast days. Southern France, with its Mediterranean influences and milder climate, saw more variety in breakfast components. Olive oil might replace animal fats, and a wider range of fruits and nuts appeared on morning tables. The concept of breaking the fast with bread dipped in wine, what would eventually evolve into continental breakfast, was already established in parts of France, particularly among urban dwellers. Moving eastward into German territories, breakfast took on heartier dimensions, particularly in regions with strong traditions of animal husbandry. Sausages preserved from fall slaughtering might appear at morning meals, along with dark rye breads and beer rather than wine. Dairy played a more prominent role here than in some other regions, with cultured products like quark, a fresh cheese, consumed when available. In Scandinavia, the Viking Age was waning by 1025, but its dietary influences remained strong. Breakfast often consisted of leftover stew from the previous evening, reheated over the morning fire. Fish was prominent, particularly in coastal areas, and might be consumed dried, salted, or fresh, depending on availability. Barley porridge sweetened with honey or berries offered sustenance during the brief northern growing season. A distinctive feature of Norse breakfast was the consumption of skyr, a cultured dairy product resembling thick yogurt that remains popular. In Iceland today, high in protein and preservable longer than fresh milk, skyr provided crucial nutrition during the harsh northern winters. Rye and oats were the dominant breakfast grains, often consumed as porridge or flatbreads. The Mediterranean world presented yet another breakfast landscape, one where the influences of ancient Rome lingered more strongly than in the north. In Byzantine territories and parts of Italy, breakfast typically consisted of bread dipped in wine, a direct continuation of Roman practices. This might be supplemented with olives, cheese, and seasonal fruits. Breakfast in Mediterranean regions was generally lighter than in Northern Europe, reflecting both climate differences and cultural attitudes toward the morning meal. The concept of jentaculum, a light first meal, persisted from Roman times, with the main meal of the day occurring later. The Islamic world in 1025 encompassed vast territories from Spain to Central Asia, with sophisticated culinary traditions, influenced by religious practices, trade networks, and ancient wisdom. Islamic medical writings of the period, building on Greek and Persian foundations, paid considerable attention to proper eating habits, including breakfast. The physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, writing in the early 11th century, recommended beginning the day with foods that were easily digestible and warming to the body. His suggestions included soft-boiled eggs, bread with olive oil and dates, a breakfast combination still consumed throughout parts of the Middle East today. In Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain. Breakfast might include pan-fried flatbreads with honey, or cheese, fresh or dried fruits, and perhaps almond-based drinks. The absence of pork and the preference for lamb reflected religious dietary restrictions, while the sophisticated agriculture of the region provided a wider range of fruits and vegetables than available in northern Europe. Baghdad, Cairo, and other major Islamic cities had developed vibrant food cultures by the 11th century, including street vendors selling morning foods to urban workers. Vendors offered fuel, a dish of cooked fava beans, various breads and sweet rice dishes that could be purchased on the way to work or consumed in small shop fronts. In contrast to both European and Islamic traditions, breakfast in Song Dynasty China appeared remarkably modern in some respects. Urban residents often purchased breakfast from specialized vendors rather than preparing it at home, an early form of the grab-and-go concept so familiar to modern commuters. Rice congee, a porridge made by cooking rice with excess water until it breaks down into a creamy consistency, formed the foundation of many Chinese breakfasts. Regional variations abounded, with northern areas favoring millet or wheat-based alternatives. Congee could be dressed with pickled vegetables, fermented bean products, dried fish, or fresh herbs depending on season and location. Another breakfast staple was youtiao, deep-fried dough sticks often dipped in warm soy milk or congee. Though the exact origin of youtiao remains contested among food historians, versions of this breakfast item were already established by the 11th century. Chinese breakfast traditions also included steamed buns filled with vegetables or sweetened bean paste, rice noodles served in broth, and various preservation techniques that allowed protein sources like salted duck eggs to be stored and consumed during lean seasons. Tea, already cultivated in China for centuries by this period, accompanied morning meals among those who could afford it. Unlike the highly processed tea of later periods, 11th century Chinese tea preparation involved grinding tea leaves into powder and whisking them into hot water, a method closer to modern matcha preparation than to tea bags. Japan in 1025 was, amid its Heian period, characterized by sophisticated court culture and strong Chinese influences. Yet Japanese breakfast traditions were developing their own distinctive characteristics. Rice remained central, often consumed plain as part of a set meal that included small portions of fish, pickled vegetables, and miso soup. The concept of distinct breakfast foods was more developed in Japan than in many Western regions. Morning dishes tended to be simpler and less heavily seasoned than those consumed later in the day. Preservation methods were highly advanced, with fermentation, pickling, and drying, allowing for a diverse breakfast despite seasonal limitations. In Korea's Goryeo dynasty, breakfast typically included rice, soup, and banchan, side dishes of vegetables, fish, or occasionally meat, prepared with distinctive preservation and fermentation techniques. Kimchi and other fermented foods provided crucial nutrients during winter months when fresh produce was unavailable. Moving to the Indian subcontinent, breakfast in 1025 varied dramatically by region, religion, and social position. In northern areas under the influence of the Ghaznavid dynasty, wheat-based flatbreads, accompanied by lentil preparations, featured prominently. In southern regions, rice remained the staple grain, often prepared as kanji, rice gruel similar to congee, for breakfast. Hindu dietary restrictions shaped breakfast practices for many, with vegetarian options predominating in certain regions. And among certain castes, dairy products, particularly yogurt, clarified butter, ghee, and fresh cheese, paneer, provided protein in vegetarian diets. Among the most distinctive aspects of Indian breakfast traditions was the sophisticated use of spices for both flavor and their perceived medicinal properties. Turmeric, cumin, coriander, and countless other spices transformed basic ingredients into complex flavor profiles, even at breakfast time. Across the equator in sub-Saharan Africa, breakfast traditions in 1025 reflected the incredible diversity of cultural groups and agricultural systems across the continent. In West African regions where grains like millet and sorghum dominated agriculture, morning meals often featured porridges, sometimes fermented for improved digestibility and flavor. The Kingdom of Ghana, reaching its peak of influence around this time, had developed sophisticated trade networks that brought North African influences to morning meals among the wealthy, including dried fruits and occasionally wheat products that had to be imported from northern regions. In East Africa, the intermingling of Bantu agricultural traditions with Arab and Persian influences created distinctive breakfast patterns. Along coastal regions, dishes incorporating coconut, rice, and seafood could appear at morning meals, while inland areas relied more heavily on indigenous grains and cooking methods. Ethiopian highlands maintained unique culinary traditions with injera, a sourdough flatbread made from teff flour, serving as both staple food and eating utensil for breakfast and all other meals. Accompanying dishes might include wat, stew, beans, or dairy products from the region's pastoral traditions. In the Americas, breakfast practices around 1025 existed entirely separate from the Eurasian and African traditions we've explored so far. In Mesoamerica, the Maya civilization continued to flourish in the Yucatan Peninsula and surrounding regions, while in South America, the pre-Inca civilizations were developing their own sophisticated food systems. Maize formed the backbone of Mesoamerican breakfast, most commonly consumed as tortillas or as atole, a warm, masa-based beverage that could be flavored with chili, fruit, or honey. Beans provided complementary protein, while chia seeds offered additional nutrition. In the Andean regions, breakfast might include quinoa porridge, potatoes prepared through various methods including freeze-drying to create chuño, and perhaps maize beer, chicha for adults. The incredible vertical ecology of the Andes allowed for diverse food crops at different elevations, contributing to breakfast variety despite the absence of wheat, rice, or dairy animals. In North American regions, breakfast among indigenous peoples varied dramatically by region. Northeastern woodland peoples might consume corn porridge or bread made from ground nuts mixed with cornmeal. Plains groups who relied heavily on bison might begin the day with pemmican, a concentrated mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries that provided substantial energy for active lifestyles. Pacific Northwest peoples, with access to abundant seafood, might break their fast with dried salmon and berries, while in the arid Southwest, breakfast could include corn preparations and foraged desert plants. What becomes clear in this global survey is that breakfast a millennium ago was simultaneously simpler and more complex than our modern morning meals. Simpler in its ingredients, rarely more than a handful of locally available components, yet more complex in its intimate connection to agricultural cycles, preservation techniques, and cultural rules. Modern breakfast eaters seldom consider whether a particular food is in season, whether it complies with religious restrictions for that specific day of the liturgical calendar, or whether it appropriately reflects their social position. Those living in 1025 had no such luxury of unconscious consumption. The agricultural realities of the 11th century imposed strict limitations on what could appear in morning meals. Without modern refrigeration, transportation networks, or preservation techniques, most breakfast ingredients had to be either produced locally or preserved through traditional methods like drying, smoking, fermentation, or salting. Seasonal variations were extreme. In temperate regions, winter breakfasts relied heavily on stored grains and preserved foods, while summer and autumn brought fresh fruits, vegetables, dairy, and eggs. This seasonality was not a fashionable choice, but an inescapable reality that shaped breakfast expectations and practices. Storage technologies played crucial roles in determining breakfast possibilities. Ceramic containers protected grains from moisture and pests. Smoking chambers preserved meat through winter. Salt, one of the most valuable commodities of the medieval world, made protein preservation possible. Without these technologies, the already limited breakfast options would have been narrower still. Cooking technologies were similarly fundamental to breakfast preparation. The open hearth, the central cooking apparatus in most homes across cultures in 1025, demanded different cooking techniques than modern stoves. Foods were typically boiled, roasted, or baked in embers, rather than precisely controlled. This shaped what could be prepared and how it tasted. Even eating technologies influenced the breakfast experience. Without widespread use of individual plates and full cutlery sets in many cultures, eating methods differed substantially from modern practices. Shared bowls, bread as both food and utensil, and communal drinking vessels were common across many societies. The daily rhythms surrounding breakfast also differed markedly from modern patterns. Without artificial lighting, most people rose and slept with the sun, making breakfast time seasonal as well. Winter breakfasts might occur well after sunrise, while summer meals could begin in early dawn light. Work patterns determined both when breakfast occurred and what it contained. Agricultural laborers needed substantial morning nutrition before hours in the fields, while urban craftspeople or merchants might eat lighter, later breakfasts. Monastic communities structured their entire days, including meals around prayer schedules rather than secular work demands. Gender roles shaped breakfast dramatically. In most cultures of 1025, food preparation fell predominantly to women, who balanced morning cooking responsibilities with childcare and their own work requirements. The first person awake in a household was typically the woman responsible for rekindling the fire and beginning breakfast preparation. Children's breakfast experiences varied by culture and class, but generally mirrored adult patterns with adjustments for age. Across cultures, young children might receive special preparations like softened bread in milk or watered porridge before graduating to adult fare. Elderly members of households faced their own breakfast challenges. In an era before dentistry as we know it, tooth loss was common with age. Softer foods, porridges, soups, bread soaked in liquids became increasingly important for older adults who could no longer chew effectively. Beyond these practical considerations, breakfast in 1025 carried significant symbolic weight across cultures. The first meal represented hospitality, community, and often religious observance. Sharing breakfast created and reinforced social bonds within households and communities. In many Christian contexts, breakfast timing connected directly to religious services. Early communion services were often observed while fasting, with breakfast following as a communal breaking of that fast. Similarly, in Islamic regions, breakfast during Ramadan, the pre-dawn suhoor meal, held special significance as preparation for the day's fasting ahead. Even the seating arrangements at breakfast reflected and reinforced social hierarchies. Who ate first, who received choice portions, and who served others varied by culture, but almost universally demonstrated status relationships within families and wider communities. The physical spaces of breakfast consumption similarly encoded social meaning. Peasant families might gather around a central hearth, while noble households maintained specialized eating areas. In monasteries, refectories, dining halls, were designed specifically for communal meals taken in silence or accompanied by religious readings. As we consider these breakfast practices from 1,000 years ago, certain patterns emerge across cultural contexts despite vast geographical separation. Grains, whether rice in East Asia, wheat in the Mediterranean, or maize in the Americas, formed the foundation of most breakfast traditions worldwide. Their transformation into porridges, breads, or other staples represents a fundamental similarity. Across human societies, preservation techniques show similar cross-cultural patterns. Every society developed methods to extend the usability of seasonal foods, whether through fermentation in Korea, smoking in Northern Europe, or sun-drying in the Andes. These techniques were not just practical necessities, but became defining elements of breakfast traditions that persist today. The relationship between breakfast and labor appears consistently across cultures as well. Whether peasants in feudal Europe, farmers in Song Dynasty China, or agricultural workers in West Africa, those performing physical labor typically consumed more substantial morning meals than those in sedentary positions. Religious influences on breakfast transcended specific faiths. Whether through Christian fasting regulations, Islamic dietary laws, or Hindu vegetarian practices, spiritual beliefs shaped morning meals across continents. The sacred and the quotidian met each morning at the breakfast table, regardless of which deities were worshipped. Class distinctions in breakfast practices reveal another cross-cultural pattern. While specific foods and preparations varied enormously, the principle that higher status individuals consumed more varied, refined, and abundant morning meals appears consistently across societies. Yet within these broad similarities, the incredible diversity of human adaptation to different environments becomes apparent. The specific ingredients, preparation methods, and cultural meanings attached to breakfast varied dramatically based on available resources, climate conditions, and cultural histories. The absence of certain modern breakfast staples would be immediately apparent to any time traveler visiting breakfast tables in 1025. Coffee, perhaps the most iconic modern breakfast beverage worldwide, remained unknown outside its Ethiopian homeland and parts of the Islamic world. It wouldn't reach Europe until the 16th century. Tea, while already important in Chinese breakfast culture, had not yet begun its journey to becoming a global morning staple. Chocolate, derived from cacao beans native to the Americas, remained entirely unknown to Europeans, Asians, and Africans. Sugar, as we know it, was a rare luxury item in most regions, available only to the extremely wealthy in Europe and more commonly used in Islamic and Indian contexts. Honey remained the primary sweetener across many cultures, used sparingly due to its seasonal availability and value. Citrus fruits, now morning staples in the form of orange juice or breakfast garnishes, were exotic luxuries in Northern Europe. Though more common in Mediterranean and Middle Eastern regions, the concept of breakfast fruit juice would have been alien to most 11th century breakfast consumers. Dairy consumption varied dramatically by region, limited by both cultural practices and lactose tolerance. The fresh milk glass common on modern breakfast tables would have been rare, with most dairy consumed as cheese, butter, or fermented products like yogurt that reduced lactose content. Perhaps most significantly, the entire concept of industrially produced breakfast foods, from cereals to frozen waffles to instant oatmeal, lay nearly a millennium in the future. Every breakfast component required significant human labor to produce, preserve, and prepare. The transition from these 11th century breakfast practices to our modern morning meals unfolded gradually through subsequent centuries, driven by a series of transformative developments. The Columbian Exchange, following 1492, introduced new breakfast ingredients across continents: potatoes and tomatoes to Europe, wheat to the Americas, and eventually coffee worldwide. The Industrial Revolution transformed not just what people ate for breakfast, but how it was produced, packaged, and prepared. Factory production of foods created new categories of breakfast options, most notably with the development of ready-to-eat cereals in the late 19th century. Refrigeration technology revolutionized breakfast possibilities, making perishable items like fresh milk, eggs and fruit available year-round regardless of local growing seasons. Global transportation networks further disconnected breakfast from local agricultural cycles, allowing oranges in winter and tropical fruits in northern climates. The development of time-conscious urban workforces during industrialization created new priorities for breakfast, speed and convenience, that would have been foreign to agricultural societies of 1025. Breakfast became increasingly standardized as workday start times grew more rigid. Commercial interests became powerful shapers of breakfast habits, with advertising campaigns convincing consumers of the necessity of certain foods or beverages. The very concept of breakfast foods as a distinct category was partially created through marketing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Public health campaigns and nutritional science added another dimension to breakfast evolution, promoting certain practices as healthier than others. The modern emphasis on breakfast as the most important meal emerged largely from 20th century nutritional thinking rather than historical precedent. Yet despite these transformative changes, echoes of 11th century breakfast practices persist in cultures worldwide. The congee served in Chinese households today bears remarkable similarity to what Song dynasty residents consumed. Yemeni bread and honey breakfasts would be recognizable to their ancestors. Porridge remains a morning staple across northern Europe. A millennium later, these continuities reveal something profound about breakfast as a cultural institution, its capacity to preserve tradition amid dramatic technological and social change. Morning meals, perhaps more than any other daily food ritual, tend to maintain connections to cultural heritage even as societies transform around them. As modern diners reach for steel-cut oats, they unknowingly participate in a breakfast tradition spanning 1,000 years. When Japanese families consume rice and fish at breakfast, they maintain patterns established during the Heian period. Ethiopian injera, served at breakfast, represents one of the world's oldest, continuously maintained food traditions. What explains this remarkable persistence? Breakfast occurs at a vulnerable transition point in the daily cycle, the move from sleep to activity, when humans often seek comfort in the familiar. The foods we consume upon waking carry emotional associations with home, safety, and cultural identity that resist rapid change. The intimate connection between breakfast and household life has also insulated it somewhat from commercial influence, at least compared to other meals. While lunch increasingly moved outside the home during industrialization and dinner became a showcase for new ingredients and techniques, breakfast remained more conservative, more connected to domestic traditions. Religions. Continued influence on breakfast practices provides another thread of continuity. While secularization has diminished religious food restrictions in many societies, traditional breakfast patterns originally shaped by religious rules often persist through cultural inertia, even when their religious significance has faded. Yet, alongside these continuities, breakfast has undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of any meal over the past 1,000 years. The modern breakfast table, with its coffee from Ethiopia, tea from China, sugar from the Caribbean, wheat from the Great Plains, and eggs from industrial farms, represents a level of global integration unimaginable to those breaking their fast in 1025. The social context of breakfast has similarly transformed. What was once almost universally a communal family meal has increasingly become individualized, rushed, or even skipped entirely as work patterns, family structures, and nutritional beliefs have evolved. The sacred space of shared morning meals has diminished in many societies. Technological mediation of breakfast represents another profound shift. Where once the preparation of morning foods required direct engagement with fire, water and raw ingredients, many modern breakfasts require little more than pushing buttons on electronic devices or opening packages. This distance from production fundamentally alters our relationship with morning nourishment. Perhaps most significantly, the connection between breakfast and local agriculture, a defining feature of morning meals in 1025, has been almost entirely severed for many modern consumers. Few breakfast eaters today could identify where their morning foods originated or how they were grown. The seasons pass unnoticed on the breakfast table, with strawberries in December and pumpkin spice in August. What has been gained and lost in this 1,000-year transformation of the first meal? The modern breakfast offers unparalleled choice, convenience, and consistency. Nutritional science has improved our understanding of morning nutrition beyond anything imaginable to our ancestors. Global influences have enriched breakfast traditions across cultures, yet something has been lost in this transformation as well. The intimate connection between humans and their food sources, knowing who grew the grain in your porridge or collected the eggs for your breakfast, has diminished. The rhythm of seasonal eating, with its anticipation of first fruits and adaptation to winter scarcity, no longer guides our morning expectations. The skills involved in breakfast preparation have similarly declined. Where once complex preservation techniques and cooking methods were common knowledge passed between generations, many modern breakfast eaters possess few food preparation skills beyond operating electrical appliances. The social aspects of breakfast, the gathering of family or household members around a shared morning meal, have weakened in many societies as individualized eating patterns become more common. The breakfast table as a site of daily connection and conversation has diminished in importance. Time consciousness around breakfast has intensified dramatically. Where once the morning meal occurred within a natural rhythm determined by sunlight and seasonal work patterns, modern breakfast often takes place within strict time constraints imposed by external work schedules and commuting demands. Perhaps most profoundly, the very meaning of breakfast has shifted. What was once a universal human practice of breaking the night's fast, according to available resources and cultural rules, has become a contested space of nutritional claims, commercial interests, and lifestyle statements. We ask our breakfasts to perform identity work never expected of morning meals in 1025. As we recognize these transformations, we might consider what wisdom lies in those ancient breakfast practices. Not to romanticize the constraints and hardships faced by our ancestors, but to recognize what elements of their relationship with morning nourishment might still hold value in our radically different world. The connection between breakfast and physical energy needs remains relevant. While many modern workers no longer perform the manual labor typical of agricultural societies, the body's need for morning replenishment after overnight fasting continues. The intuitive understanding our ancestors had about matching breakfast to the day's expected activities offers a more personalized approach than one-size-fits-all nutritional prescriptions. The seasonal rhythms that once dictated breakfast options encouraged diversity in diet across the year, a practice modern nutritionists recognize as beneficial even as our food systems have made it optional rather than necessary. Reconnecting breakfast to seasonal patterns might enhance both environmental sustainability and nutritional variety. The communal aspects of breakfast in historical contexts, the sharing of food within households and communities, built social connections that many modern societies now struggle to maintain. The breakfast table as a site of daily family connection deserves reconsideration in an era of individualized eating. The skills involved in traditional breakfast preparation, whether baking bread, fermenting dairy, or preserving seasonal abundance, connected people intimately with their food in ways that opening packages cannot replicate. The satisfaction and agency that comes from such skills remains available to those willing to invest time in learning them. Perhaps most fundamentally, the acceptance of constraints that characterized breakfast in 1025, eating what was available, appropriate to the season, and consistent with one's social position and religious obligations, offers a counterpoint to modern breakfast anxieties. Our ancestors worried about having enough to eat. We often worry about making the right breakfast choices amid overwhelming options. As we look back across a millennium of breakfast practices, what emerges is not simply a catalogue of historical curiosities, but a mirror reflecting our changing relationship with food, time, community, and the natural world. In examining what people ate to break their fast 1,000 years ago, we ultimately learn as much about ourselves as about our ancestors. The humble barley porridge consumed by an English peasant, the rice congee purchased from a Song dynasty, street vendor, and the maize tortillas prepared in a Maya household each represented solutions to the universal human challenge of morning nourishment. Each was perfectly adapted to its environmental, technological, and cultural context. Modern breakfast eaters face different challenges. Not scarcity, but overwhelming choice. Not preservation limitations, but disconnection from food sources. Not rigid social hierarchies, but often the absence of shared meal experiences altogether. Our breakfast solutions must address these contemporary circumstances. Yet the fundamental human need to break the fast after sleep remains constant across 1,000 years of dramatic change. In this most basic of daily practices, the first meal that prepares us to face the day, we find both profound difference from our ancestors and enduring connection to them. As we reach for our morning coffee, cold cereal, congee, or tortillas, we participate in traditions both ancient and constantly evolving. We bring the past to our present tables, carrying forward the accumulated wisdom of countless morning meals across a millennium of human experience. In this continuity amid transformation lies the true story of breakfast, not just what people ate 1,000 years ago, but what it means to begin each day with nourishment across all human history. Our breakfasts, like those of our ancestors, remain daily solutions to universal human needs: physical sustenance, sensory pleasure, social connection, and cultural belonging. The ingredients and methods have transformed dramatically since 1025, but these fundamental functions persist. In satisfying them each morning, we demonstrate both how far we have traveled from our ancestors and how deeply we remain connected to them. Perhaps the most valuable insight from examining breakfast a millennium ago is the reminder that all food practices exist within specific contexts: environmental, technological, economic, and cultural. There is no single natural or correct way to break the fast, only solutions adapted to particular circumstances. This perspective offers both humility about our modern breakfast certainties and appreciation for the ingenuity our ancestors brought to their morning meals. As we conclude our exploration of breakfast in 1025, we might consider how our own morning meals will appear to observers 1,000 years in the future. Will they marvel at our coffee dependence, our sugar consumption, our individualized eating patterns? Will they see wisdom in some of our practices and short-sightedness in others? Will they recognize their own breakfast experiences in ours, just as we can glimpse familiar patterns in the morning meals of our ancestors? These questions remind us that breakfast, like all human practices, exists within the flow of history. Today's common breakfast foods were once unknown innovations. Current nutritional certainties will likely be revised by future understanding. The technology transforming how we acquire and prepare morning foods continues to evolve rapidly. What remains constant is breakfast's fundamental purpose: to prepare body and mind for the day ahead, to transition from sleep to wakefulness, and to connect us with our communities through shared sustenance. In this essential function, breakfast a millennium ago and breakfast today stand as points on the same continuum of human experience. The archaeological evidence of ancient breakfast practices remains frustratingly incomplete. Unlike grand buildings or burial goods, the humble implements of daily meals often leave minimal traces. Yet careful excavation of household sites across cultures reveals hearths with cooking residues, grinding stones worn smooth by repeated use, and pottery fragments that once held morning porridges or gruels. At medieval European sites, archaeologists have recovered cooking pots blackened by years of suspension over open flames, the very vessels in which countless batches of morning pottage were prepared. Analysis of residues sometimes reveals the specific grains or legumes cooked within. Then, carbonized remains of breads occasionally survive, offering glimpses of daily consumption patterns. Written evidence provides another window into historical breakfast practices. Monastery records meticulously document food provisions, including morning allocations. Estate accounts record grain distributions to servants and workers. Medical texts across cultures offer recommendations for healthful morning eating according to prevailing theories. In Islamic contexts, hadith literature, records of the Prophet Muhammad's sayings and practices, influenced breakfast choices. For the devout, his reported fondness for dates, broken his fast, established a tradition that persists today during Ramadan. Chinese medical texts similarly shaped breakfast practices through theories about proper morning nutrition for different body types and seasons. Literary works occasionally mention breakfast practices, though rarely in the detail modern food historians might wish. The 10th century Japanese work The Pillow Book by Sei Shonagon includes passing references to morning meals that help illuminate court practices. European chronicles sometimes mention breakfast served to travelers or distinguished guests. Artistic depictions, though rarer for breakfast than for more formal meals, provide visual evidence of morning eating. Illuminated manuscripts occasionally show peasants consuming morning meals in field settings or monks taking their mixtum. Chinese paintings of street life sometimes include breakfast vendors with their portable cook stoves and crowds of customers. These fragments of evidence require careful interpretation by food historians who must avoid projecting modern breakfast assumptions onto historical contexts. The tendency to assume that historical people ate foods similar to modern, traditional breakfasts in their regions can lead to misconceptions about actual practices. The intimate connection between breakfast and labor in historical contexts deserves particular attention. For most people in most places a millennium ago, breakfast directly fueled physical work. The modern conceptual separation between food as fuel and food as pleasure would have seemed foreign to most breakfast consumers in 1025. Agricultural. Workers across cultures consumed morning meals specifically designed to provide sustained energy through long hours of physical exertion. The predominance of complex carbohydrates, whether as porridges, breads, or rice, reflects this practical reality. These foods released energy gradually, preventing the mid-morning hunger that would have disrupted essential work. Protein sources, when available, supplemented these carbohydrate foundations. Eggs appeared on breakfast tables where chickens were kept. Cheese provided shelf-stable dairy protein when fresh milk was unavailable or culturally avoided. Fish, either fresh or preserved, offered morning protein in coastal regions and along riverways. Fat, a concentrated energy source, particularly valuable for physical labor, featured prominently in many historical breakfast traditions. Olive oil in Mediterranean contexts, butter in northern European dairy regions, and animal fats in meat-consuming cultures all provided caloric density and staying power to morning meals. The modern tendency to divide foods into breakfast-appropriate and non-breakfast categories would have seemed arbitrary to most people in 1025. Leftovers from evening meals commonly appeared at morning tables, a practice that maximized resources and minimized food waste. The strict categorization of certain foods as breakfast foods largely emerged from commercial interests in later centuries. Children's breakfast experiences in 1025 would surprise many modern parents accustomed to child-specific breakfast foods. Young children across cultures generally consumed smaller portions of adult foods, perhaps with textural modifications to accommodate developing teeth and digestive systems. The concept of special children's breakfast foods remained centuries. In the future, elite children might receive more nutritionally dense morning meals reflecting their privileged status, but rarely entirely different foods from adults. Even royal children in medieval Europe consumed variations of the same breakfast staples as their parents, though perhaps with finer ingredients and more careful preparation. The modern emphasis on breakfast variety would have seemed foreign in many historical contexts. People across cultures commonly consumed essentially the same breakfast every day, with variations based on seasonal availability rather than preference for novelty. This repetition simplified morning routines and eliminated decision fatigue about the day's first meal. Morning beverage choices in 1025 differed dramatically from modern options. Water, often unsafe for consumption without treatment, rarely appeared as a standalone breakfast beverage in urban areas. Instead, various fermented drinks offered safer hydration. Beer or ale accompanied European breakfasts across social classes, though lower in alcohol content than modern equivalents. Wine served as a common morning beverage in Mediterranean regions and among European elites. Often diluted with water and sometimes warmed, breakfast wine provided both hydration and calories. Milk appeared rarely as a drinking beverage due to spoilage concerns and widespread lactose intolerance, though it might be consumed by young children. Tea had established itself as the predominant breakfast beverage in China by 1025, though preparation methods differed from modern practices. Tea leaves were often compressed into cakes, fragments of which would be broken off, powdered, and whisked into hot water. A method preserved today in Japanese tea ceremony, but otherwise largely replaced by leaf infusion. Coffee remained unknown as a breakfast beverage in most regions, though it had begun its spread from Ethiopia through parts of the Islamic world. Its eventual dominance as the global morning beverage of choice lay centuries in the future, awaiting cultural acceptance and distribution networks that would make it widely available. Fruit juices, now morning staples in many cultures, rarely appeared at breakfast tables a millennium ago. The labor involved in extracting juice made it impractical for daily consumption, and preservation difficulties meant that fruit juice was necessarily seasonal rather than year-round. Whole fruits, when available, were more commonly consumed. The physical settings of breakfast consumption varied dramatically by culture and class in 1025. European peasant households typically ate around the central hearth that served as cooking space, heat source and light source. Urban artisan families might have slightly more specialized eating areas, but still typically consumed meals in multi-purpose spaces. Elite European households maintained greater separation between food preparation and consumption. By the 11th century, designated dining areas had emerged in castles and manor houses, though not yet the specialized dining rooms of later centuries. Morning meals might be taken in private chambers for the highest status individuals. Monastery refectories provided perhaps the most specialized eating spaces in European contexts, with long tables accommodating the entire religious community. These meals typically occurred in silence or accompanied by scripture readings, creating a contemplative breakfast experience markedly different from secular households. In Islamic regions, The courtyard often served as a pleasant breakfast setting. When weather permitted, the traditional architecture of homes around central courtyards facilitated family gathering for morning meals in a space that offered fresh air while maintaining privacy from public view. Chinese urban dwellers increasingly consumed breakfast away from home by the 11th century, purchasing morning foods from specialized vendors. Street corners, market stalls, and small shops developed as breakfast spaces, showing remarkable similarity to modern grab-and-go breakfast patterns despite the vast temporal distance. Japanese aristocratic households maintained exquisite attention to the aesthetics of dining spaces, with breakfast settings reflecting seasonal themes through carefully selected dishes, decor elements, and even the arrangement of food. This elevated the morning meal beyond mere nutrition to a daily aesthetic experience. The timing of breakfast varies significantly across cultures and contexts in 1025. Without standardized clock time, natural daylight primarily determined when people broke their fast. This created seasonal variation in breakfast timing, with earlier morning meals during long summer days and later breakfasts during winter. Religious observances further influenced breakfast timing. Christian monasteries structured their days around prayer schedules, with morning meals timed in relation to liturgical hours rather than clock time. During Islamic Ramadan, the pre-dawn suhoor meal occurred at a specific astronomical twilight point regardless of season. Work requirements provided another timing determinant. Agricultural laborers typically consumed breakfast shortly after dawn before heading to the fields. Urban craftspeople might eat somewhat later, after opening workshops, but before beginning the day's main production tasks. Elites without manual labor responsibilities often broke their fast later still. This variation in breakfast timing demonstrates how differently people experienced time itself a millennium ago. Without mechanical clocks or standardized time zones, communities operated on local solar time and flexible schedules determined by sunlight, seasonal needs, and community rhythms rather than rigid timetables. The language used to describe breakfast reveals cultural attitudes toward the morning meal. The English term breakfast literally describes breaking the overnight fast, a functional, straightforward concept. Similar literal constructions appear in several Germanic languages, suggesting a practical view of the meal's purpose. Romance languages often use terms derived from Latin that specifically denote the meal's timing rather than its function. The French petit déjeuner, little lunch, positions it as a minor precursor to the day's main meal. This linguistic framing reflects regional attitudes toward breakfast as a necessary but relatively unimportant eating occasion. Chinese terminology. For breakfast, Zhaokan translates literally as early meal, a straightforward temporal designation. However, regional variations in Chinese breakfast terminology often incorporate specific food references, reflecting the importance of distinct regional breakfast traditions. Arabic includes multiple terms for breakfast, depending on context. The standard term iftar now primarily refers to breaking the Ramadan fast at sunset, while futur describes the regular morning meal. During Ramadan, Suhoor specifically names the pre-dawn meal before fasting begins, a linguistic distinction reflecting religious practice. These linguistic variations reflect differing cultural emphases, whether on the meal's function, timing, or religious significance. They remind us that even the concept of breakfast is not universal, but culturally constructed and understood through specific frames of reference. The nutritional composition of breakfasts in 1025 differed significantly from modern ideals, though not necessarily for the worse, by contemporary nutritional understanding. Grain-based breakfasts provided complex carbohydrates that released energy slowly, an advantage for physical laborers. Fermented foods across cultures offered probiotic benefits, not yet scientifically understood, but intuitively recognized through experience. The limited availability of sugar in most regions prevented the high-sweetness breakfast foods common today. Honey, fruit, and occasionally dried fruits provided natural sweetness in moderation rather than the concentrated sugars of modern commercial breakfast foods. This absence of refined sugar protected dental health and prevented blood sugar spikes. The seasonal nature of food availability enforced dietary variety throughout the year, a pattern nutritionists now recognize as beneficial. Spring brought new greens and dairy, summer added fruits and vegetables, autumn contributed nuts and late harvests, and winter relied on preserved foods. This rotating menu provided different nutrient profiles across seasons. Preservation methods sometimes enhanced nutritional value even while extending shelf life. Fermentation increased bioavailability of nutrients in many traditional breakfast foods, from yogurt in the Mediterranean to kimchi in Korea. Drying fruits concentrated their nutritional content while making them available beyond fresh seasons. Conversely, winter diets in many regions suffered from limited fresh produce, leading to seasonal nutritional deficiencies. Vitamin C shortages particularly affected northern populations during late winter and early spring before new growth appeared. These shortages contributed to seasonal health challenges largely unknown in modern year-round food systems. Portion sizes generally reflected energy requirements more accurately than modern breakfasts often do. Physical laborers consumed substantial morning meals appropriate to their high-energy expenditure, while those in sedentary positions ate more moderately. This intuitive matching of intake to output occurred without calorie counting or formal nutritional knowledge. The modern breakfast dichotomy between healthy and indulgent choices would have made little sense in 1025, when most morning foods were simply what was available and appropriate to social position. The moralization of breakfast choices, the sense that certain options are virtuous while others represent weakness, emerged primarily in the 19th and 20th centuries. Health concerns did influence historical breakfast practices, but through different frameworks than modern nutritional science. Humoral medicine, the system that dominated European, Islamic, and many Asian medical traditions, recommended specific breakfast choices based on individual constitutions and seasonal conditions rather than universal prescriptions. This personalized approach recognized that different bodies might need different morning nourishment, a concept increasingly supported by modern research on chronotypes, metabolic variation, and personalized nutrition. The one-size-fits-all breakfast recommendations common in 20th century nutritional guidance have given way to more individualized approaches that ironically echo these ancient understandings. Religious influences on breakfast extended beyond timing to include profound ethical dimensions. Fasting practices across faiths encouraged mindfulness about food consumption and gratitude for sustenance. The breaking of fasts, whether daily or after longer religious observances, carried spiritual significance that elevated breakfast beyond mere physical nourishment. Prayers before morning meals appeared across religious traditions, acknowledging divine provision and human dependence. These practices created a moment of mindfulness before eating that contrasts sharply with the often rushed, distracted nature of modern breakfast consumption. The sacred dimension of breaking the fast has largely faded from secular breakfast experiences. The communal nature of breakfast in most historical contexts fostered social cohesion within households and communities. Family members across generations shared morning meals, creating daily opportunities for knowledge transmission, problem-solving, and relationship maintenance. This communal dimension has diminished dramatically in many modern societies. The decline of shared family breakfasts represents one of the most significant social transformations in daily eating patterns over the past century. What was once nearly universal, the gathering of household members for morning meals, has become exceptional in many contexts, replaced by individualized, staggered, or entirely skipped breakfast routines. This transformation reflects broader social changes, increased workforce participation across genders, longer commutes, institutional breakfasts in schools and workplaces, and greater value placed on individual preference and choice. The social functions once served by communal breakfasts have shifted to other times or disappeared entirely from daily rhythms. The commercialization of breakfast, perhaps the most dramatic transformation between 1025 and today, began primarily in the 19th century with industrialization and mass marketing. Ready-to-eat cereals, initially developed as health foods by religious reformers, became commercial powerhouses that fundamentally altered breakfast expectations, particularly in Western contexts. Breakfast became big business, with specialized products marketed specifically for morning consumption. The concept of breakfast foods as a distinct category, items appropriate only or primarily for this specific meal, emerged largely through commercial pressures rather than natural evolution of eating practices. Marketing campaigns portrayed traditional breakfast patterns as outdated or nutritionally inferior, while promoting manufactured alternatives as modern, scientific, and convenient. These messages transformed cultural expectations about appropriate morning foods and established new norms within remarkably few generations. This commercialization disconnected breakfast from both agricultural cycles and household production. Where once morning meals reflected local harvests and preservation practices, industrially produced breakfast foods could be identical regardless of season or location. This consistency came at the cost of connection to food sources and understanding of production methods. The global standardization of breakfast options represents another modern transformation. While distinct regional traditions persist, international hotel breakfasts, fast food morning menus, and commercial breakfast products show remarkable similarity worldwide. A traveler in 1025 would have encountered dramatically different breakfast options across regions. Today's travelers often find familiar options regardless of location. This standardization reflects both globalization of food systems and the international marketing of specific breakfast products and concepts. Continental breakfast, American breakfast, and their commercial variants have spread far beyond their origins, becoming global options alongside persistent regional traditions. The environmental impact of breakfast, negligible in 1025 when most components were locally produced, has expanded dramatically with global supply chains and industrial production methods. Modern breakfast items may contain ingredients from multiple continents, each with associated transportation emissions and resource requirements. Packaging waste represents another environmental dimension absent from historical breakfast experiences. Where once porridge was scooped directly from cooking pot to bowl, many modern breakfast foods arrive in multiple layers of packaging that create waste streams unknown to our ancestors. Agricultural methods for producing breakfast staples have similarly transformed, from sustainable rotation systems and mixed farming in 1025 to industrial monocultures for modern cereal grains, concentrated animal feeding operations for eggs and dairy, and plantation agriculture for coffee, tea, and tropical fruits. Water usage for modern breakfast production dwarfs historical requirements. Coffee alone, unknown as a breakfast beverage in most regions in 1025, requires approximately 140 liters of water to produce a single cup when agricultural water usage is included. This invisible water footprint represents a fundamentally different relationship with natural resources than historical breakfast patterns maintained. Energy inputs for breakfast production have similarly expanded. Where once breakfast preparation relied primarily on biomass fuels, wood, charcoal, agricultural waste, for cooking, modern breakfast systems incorporate fossil fuel inputs at every stage, from fertilizer production to processing to transportation, to refrigeration to final preparation. These environmental dimensions remained largely invisible to both historical and modern breakfast consumers. People in 1025 were no more aware of the ecological sustainability of their morning meals than most modern consumers are conscious of the environmental impact of their breakfast choices, though for opposite reasons. Historical breakfasts were sustainable by necessity. Modern breakfasts often unsustainable by design. The remarkable diversity of breakfast practices across cultures in 1025 reminds us that there is no single natural or traditional way to break the fast. Human societies developed morning meal patterns perfectly adapted to their specific circumstances, environmental conditions, available ingredients, technological capacities, and cultural values. This historical perspective offers valuable insight for modern breakfast consumers navigating contradictory nutritional claims and rapidly changing food systems. The success of diverse breakfast traditions across cultures suggests that human bodies can thrive on varied morning fare rather than requiring one optimal breakfast pattern. The most valuable lessons from historical breakfast practices may lie not in specific ingredients, but in structural patterns. The connection to seasonal and local food sources, the adaptive matching of breakfast energy to expected activities, the mindful preparation and consumption of morning meals, and the social connections fostered through shared breakfasts all represent wisdom worth reclaiming. Modern breakfast eaters enjoy unprecedented freedom of choice compared to their ancestors in 1025, where they were constrained by local availability, strict social hierarchies, and religious mandates. We face different challenges, navigating overwhelming options, sorting through competing health claims, and balancing nutrition with convenience in time-pressured mornings. Perhaps the most profound difference lies in our relationship with those choices. People in 1025 largely accepted the breakfast constraints of their time and place, focusing their agency on preparation techniques and creative use of limited ingredients. Modern consumers often experience breakfast choice as a burden, requiring daily decisions with perceived health and identity consequences. This shift from acceptance of breakfast limitations to anxiety about breakfast choices reflects broader cultural transformations. The rise of individualism, the medicalization of food, the commercialization of identity, and the paradoxical stress created by excessive options. Our technological and economic progress has solved many breakfast problems our ancestors faced, while creating new challenges they could not have imagined. As we conclude our exploration of breakfast a millennium ago, we might consider what constitutes breakfast wisdom for our own time. Neither romanticizing the limited options of historical eaters nor unquestioningly embracing industrial breakfast systems, we can instead seek balance between ancient patterns and modern knowledge. We might reclaim the seasonal rhythms that once governed breakfast, not from necessity but from choice, recognizing the environmental and nutritional benefits of eating according to local growing seasons. This need not mean austerity, but rather appreciation for the distinctive qualities of foods at their peak. We might restore the mindfulness that religious and cultural practices once brought to morning meals. Whether through formal gratitude practices or simply creating space for attention to the experience of eating, this dimension transforms breakfast from mere refueling to meaningful ritual. We might re-establish the communal aspects of breakfast where possible, recognizing the social benefits of shared morning meals in households, workplaces, or communities. Even occasional shared breakfasts create connection opportunities increasingly rare in fragmented modern schedules. We might reconsider the rigid categorization of breakfast foods, opening morning meals to greater variety and creative reuse of ingredients. The historical practice of repurposing evening leftovers for breakfast offers both sustainability benefits and liberation from commercial breakfast categories. Finally, we might approach breakfast with greater historical and cultural perspective, recognizing that what seems normal for morning meals is actually just one point in the long evolution of human breakfast practices. This perspective offers freedom from both rigid traditionalism and faddish novelty, allowing thoughtful adaptation to our specific circumstances. 1,000 years from now, scholars may look back on our breakfast practices with the same fascination. We direct toward those of 1025. They will see both continuity and transformation, patterns reflecting our particular technological moment and cultural circumstances. Perhaps they will recognize parallel challenges despite radically different contexts. The universal human need to begin each day with nourishment, connection, and preparation for what lies ahead. Breakfast, that daily ritual of breaking the night's fast, remains a constant human need across a millennium of dramatic change. From simple barley pottage in medieval cottages to elaborate global breakfast buffets, from rice congee on Song dynasty streets to grab-and-go breakfast sandwiches, the human ingenuity applied to this universal requirement reveals our adaptability, creativity, and enduring social nature. In this most basic of daily practices, repeated countless times across human lifespans, we find a thread connecting us directly to our ancestors, despite the vast differences in our circumstances. They too awakened hungry, prepared morning meals according to available resources, and faced each day fortified by breakfast suited to their particular needs and possibilities. In this continuity, amid transformation, we locate ourselves within the broader human story, just one chapter in the ongoing history of breaking the fast.